question of each of you. All right, how many questions do you feel like you answer in a day? How many problems do you feel like you answer in a day? I'm sure the number is large, and I'm sure it's constant, and it feels like, hard to keep track of how many things that you feel like you solve for in any given day. But sometimes we're outsiders looking in and we're helping somebody else solve a problem, and this is a tool that you can use for that. Sometimes we're insiders working with a team, trying to figure it out. And sometimes we're by ourselves trying to cognitively work our way through a problem of like, okay, this is complicated, this is complex. How do I want to solve it? What do I want to do about it? So really, the intent of this workshop is the same intent we have for everything that we do over at Evolve, which is to create alignment, right? How do we actually just, either if that's aligning ourselves, like getting ourselves on the same page, like buying into the decision that we want to make, if this is helping a client see something more fully and getting aligned, or if this is working with our team, helping our team get more aligned and move forward, that is always and will always be the target for us. We always think about alignment. So if you think about it like this, the squiggly ball on the left is what we often deal with, which feels like the chaos or feels like the confusion, or I like to say the quagmire of questions that plays out in our mind of like, well, should I go left? Should I go right? Should I go north, south? What do we do here? I don't know. There's no direct, simple, clear, clean answer. What we're trying to figure out is how do we go from that to, okay, everybody's on the same page, moving in the same direction, even if that everybody is just me and the voices in my own head, right? So trying to move from misalignment to alignment. So 4 pieces to the conversation today. Number 1 is essentially just the psychology of what gets in the way of us being able to solve issues. How are we in our own ways around being able to problem solve effectively? A process for identifying and crushing issues, the opportunity to kind of think about and process through a complex issue you're currently facing. So we'll give a little time for you to think through this, to go through the process. In your inbox, you should have a worksheet that goes along with this, so you can open that up and see it and follow along. And then some conversation around how to use it in the future. Because really what we often see is 3 things. And think about this both internally, in our own heads, is the solopreneur, and or how we engage with clients or how we engage our teams in conversations. We see 3 things. Number 1 is what we refer to as the downward spiral conversations. And I'll explain each of these in more detail, but downward spiral conversations. The second thing is leading with solutions. And then the third piece is seeing the symptoms, but not the systems. And so when we're actually trying to create solutions that will last, or solving a problem for the sustainable solution of that problem, these are the 3 biggest obstacles that we see. So here's each of the 3 broken down in more detail. So number 1, the downward spiral. I'm sure you've had this happen in your own head. I have, and I've seen this play out. And we've worked with hundreds of clients over the last decade. And this conversation, you can almost watch it unfold on a regular basis, which is one thing leads to the next thing, which leads to the next thing, and none of it was dealt with and none of it was solved. So, well, our sales numbers are down. Well, our sales numbers are down because we don't have a very good sales funnel. Well, we don't have a good sales funnel because we don't have a marketing person. Well, we don't have a marketing person because we don't have the budget for the marketing person. Well, we don't have the budget for the marketing person because we're not doing this thing over here. Pretty soon you're like, well, you get 4, 5, 6 people in a room, and they're all looking at it from their very particular lens, and they're sharing the different problems that they got going on. But we just spiral and spiral and spiral, and pretty soon we get to the end of the conversation and we're solving something that's way over here that had nothing to do with the thing that we were talking about when we first got started, or we're not solving anything at any point in time, right? We are simply just downward spiral conversing, and we're just talking about all the issues, and we're feeling overwhelmed or we're feeling consumed by it. So the downward spiral conversation, when we start talking about painful things, the team or the group, or even in our own heads, sometimes we like to just pile on as opposed to actually solve or actually move towards resolution. We just dump, right? And that downward spiral isn't necessarily a bad thing, but knowing how to address it and knowing how to use it is what we're going to be talking about. Downward spiral number 2 is leading with solutions. This is the piece I see the most. I think this is the piece that we all see the most, which is hey, this thing is broken. Well, you know what we should do, right? The first thing is like, well, you should just do this, or you should try this. And what we're doing is we're actually offering simple solutions to complex problems. And when we offer simple solutions to complex problems, it leads to more chaos. And so the analogy we like to use here is what happens when you lead with solutions and you start with solutions in mind is, let's say, the roof of my office here is leaking, and I might say, hey man, I don't have time to deal with the leak right now. Like I'm just going to put a bucket underneath it. Fast as, like I just led with the solution. I'm just going to put a bucket underneath it to stop the drip because I got to make sure the floor's not wet. Well, pretty soon, then the next day it's like the bucket's full, and then so I'm like, okay, now I got to dump the bucket. So I dump the bucket, put the bucket back underneath, and then there's another leak, and now I've got 2 buckets, and pretty soon I've got 3 buckets and 4 buckets and 5 buckets and 10 buckets, and now my job has become emptying buckets, right? Because of my simple solutions to a complex problem, which is, all right, I got to actually take the time to figure out how am I going to solve this roof leak problem. And I'm going to take the time to do that, and I'm going to design it in a way so I don't have to actually empty buckets. Now I've created so many simple solutions and led with solutions so much that my job has become emptying buckets. The more we do that, so leading with solutions isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's an immediate thing. It's when it compounds and compiles, and pretty soon we're spending a lot of time dealing with the things that we fixed quickly, we fixed with urgency, or we fixed incompletely, especially when it comes to people challenges, or especially when it becomes. The third one is symptoms, not systems, right? So seeing the symptoms as the whole story, not a piece of the story. And so I know that this image isn't necessarily probably very big on your screens, but that's a connect the dots exercise. The way I like to think about this one is everybody on your team has a set of dots, right? And think about those dots as pieces of information around a particular problem, right? So if we're trying to solve for, hey, revenue is down, right? Or we're not getting a lot of productivity out of our team. Okay, those are gnarly problems. There's a lot of ways of thinking about that. There's a lot of different lenses. Everybody on your team is holding a certain set of dots, but they're not holding all of the dots. They're holding 3 to 5 of those dots, right? But if the first thing I say is, well, we're not hitting our sales targets because we don't necessarily have a sales funnel that's really working. Like we're not getting the leads that we need to get. If I view that as the whole story, and pretty soon we just start solutioning on like, well, we're not getting this lead thing. What I haven't done is actually taken a comprehensive look at the system that is creating those results. I'm just looking at those dots, and I'm hoping that the dots solve the whole problem. What I need is to get all the dots on the map, and then to start to say, what's the system? What is the thing that is being shown to us? So in the systems change world, we like to say, that the system is perfectly designed to produce the results that it's producing, right? Which is like well, yeah, that makes sense kind of a statement, right? But if you think about it like that, if I'm not actually addressing the system, I'm only addressing the symptoms, I'm addressing the outputs of that system, I will continue to get the same results that I've been getting the whole time. So my job is to zoom out and see it as a system. Okay. If we move beyond those obstacles, so how do we start to work our way past those obstacles? How do human beings think, and how do we insert a process, a flow, or a framework that leverages the way humans think so that we can solve problems more effectively, get more buy-in, and actually crush the things that are in the way? There's a beginning, there's a middle, and an end, right? And it's understanding the function of these 3 pieces that helps us understand how human beings think. We think in these 3 categories. Okay, so I'm going to talk about like here are the 3 elements of a story, and the part that I like about this is 2 things. One is a story is actually structured. It is knowable and repeatable, right? We can do this in any environment. And number 2 is it actually speaks and solves problems in everybody's brain. And when we do problem solving ineffectively, it's when we leave one of these 3 categories out. And what we're doing is we're actually leaving we're leaving a lack of resolve in someone's brain. I'll explain what that means. So the beginning of the story is essentially the question, what's the current situation? Where are we? What's happening now? This is the diagnostic portion in a problem-solving methodology, right? What's the current situation? This is where we start to throw those data points, those dots that we were talking about earlier. This is where we put those up on the wall and say, what's going on, right? And this framework is every romantic comedy of all time. right? The not so happy beginning is always the bridesmaid, never the bride, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Never been in love before. The middle is where all the action takes place. How do we get there? So as Fabi was saying, that's the path. That's the what are the steps that we need to take. And the happy ending is what do they want? What's the happy ending? So in a romantic comedy, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Meet the person of their dreams, and then they fall in love. Every time. Like this is the hallmark formula, right? And whether you would admit it or not, we all like to see the happy ending. If the happy ending wasn't there, we would leave that meeting feeling like, all right. I mean, I guess like that movie, it left me feeling kind of funny, right? But it's the piece we missed most often in the problem solving methodology and the way we think about problems. We're very good at saying this is broken or this isn't working. We need to fix X. We're good at that part. The other part we do then is we jump to, well, so what are we going to do about it? And the whole time, everybody who's in that conversation, ourselves included, is thinking about, yeah, but what does it lead to? What's the outcome? What's the happy ending? And whether we want to or not, the psychology of our brains will fill in that ending on our own. And so if you're dealing with a team, every single person in that room is filling in the end on their own. And so why does solutioning get hard sometimes? Is because we'll say, hey, we can agree on what's broken, and then we'll move to solution, but all of us are fighting for the solution that leads to the end that we put in our own brain. So I'm saying, oh, no, don't do that. Do it like this, because that leads to the end that I have. And you're saying, no, don't do that. Do this, because that's leading to the end that you have. So what we have is a misaligned problem solving conversation because we haven't filled in the end. We need to solve for all three of these buckets if we are going to get people to buy in and take action. Otherwise, who wins in that conversation? The person with the most power, right? And that can create a other slew of problems, right? If my boss never listens to me, they never take my ideas, right? It can perpetuate that story. So the function of each of these, the not so happy beginning is just the beginning context. There's no action, there's no path, there's no action items, there's no to-do lists. It's just where are we? The happy ending is what's the end state we want to be in. And the trick is those two things should mirror each other. If it's broken on the front end, it's fixed on the back end. For example, on the front end, if we were to say, hey, we're not generating the income we need because we don't have the leads, we don't have the sales process in place. Okay, so on the end, then it's like, well, then we want to make sure that we're getting leads and we have the sales process in place. It is silly how effective that is when we just close the loop on the other side. So what are we actually going for? So getting clear about that outcome. So the end is just the ending context. The middle is then, and then how do we get there? So the order in which to solve a problem is not so happy beginning, happy ending, middle. You skip the middle, move to the end, and you get clear on what that end is. All right, so here's the 4-step problem solving methodology. How do we do it? All right, so it's going to build on that story structure we just talked about. So that story structure that we just talked about is going to undergird everything that we're talking about here. What I'm going to do is add kind of nuanced elements to that process. The first piece is to actually articulate what is the obstacle, right? So this is us getting out of the downward spiral conversation. It's a really simple part of the process, but it's really important to say, what are we actually solutioning for? Okay, so just naming, hey, leads are down. I want to make sure we're talking about our how to get more leads. So the obstacle is we're not getting enough leads. Okay, it's as simple as saying, what's the purpose of this conversation? And I know it sounds silly to say that, and I know it sounds silly to think about that, but how many conversations have you been in where somebody started talking about one problem and then we moved to 50 other problems? Right? So it's really important to just align on what am I actually solving for? Or what are we actually solving for in this conversation? Let's just name what that is, because as the facilitator of that process, I can say, okay, is what you just said in service of solving that problem? I can keep us focused on what are we actually solving for here? The first piece is to actually articulate what is the obstacle, right? So this is us getting out of the downward spiral conversation. It's a really simple part of the process, but it's really important to say, what are we actually solutioning for? Now I want you to just put the dots on the page. right? So before I use the connect the dot exercise, or I use the connect the dot example, and really what I'm asking you to do is just say, all right, list as many things as you can think of, right? The purpose isn't to list one element of the problem, is to list all of them, okay? Most of the time, the list will get to 10 to 15 things. The longest list I've ever been a part of was 74. That was a gnarly one. So I'll give you an example, right? So if we keep talking about, well, leads are down. Okay, well, leads are down. So, okay, well, I might say, well, we don't necessarily have, a sales funnel built out. That's one bullet. The next bullet might be, I feel like our content isn't landing with our audience. I might say, I don't think we have a really clear sense of what our audience is. And I'm just going to list, number 4 is, well, we don't really have anybody dedicated to doing sales. It's just kind of an afterthought. Okay. I'm not solving any of those things. What I'm doing is I'm just collecting the data. Those are just data points. They're there to help me see the system. So now that you have the themes, this is where we insert the opposite. This is where we insert the happy ending. Now we get to name the outcomes. And this is honestly probably the second most powerful part and the easiest part. Okay. So this is quite literally the opposite of the pain themes, right? So if the pain theme is, I don't know who it's for, I don't know what it's for, and I don't know how much to charge for it. What do we want? I want clarity about who it's for. I want clarity about what the outcomes are, and I want clarity about business model, like how much am I charging? Those 3 things are clear, right? I'm literally just flipping the pain into the outcome. I'll explain real quickly why that matters. You can also use this as a sales technique. You can also use this as a way you talk to potential customers, because what they're dealing with is like, here's the pain that's happening in my head. And so if we open the pain door and we're opening like this is a problem and we don't close that door, we leave something unresolved. Right? So if you're working with a team or you're working with a potential customer or whatever it might be, if we're opening like, hey, I don't know who this is for, I don't know what this is for, but I only address one of those things, I literally have left them thinking about those 2 things without any resolve, and they are not going to say yes to me. They are not going to buy in because it doesn't feel complete. They may not remember why it feels complete. It might be a subconscious feeling, but they are definitely feeling, yeah, something just doesn't feel right about this. That feeling comes from me opening a door and not closing it on the back end. So going back to that psychological piece, my job as the leader of the problem solving process is to make sure that if I open a pain door on the front end, I close that pain door on the back end with a solution or with an outcome, right? We're really clear on what the problem is. Here's the systemic problem, and here's how we're going to change the system. So go ahead and take a few seconds, a few minutes if needed, and just take what you had on the pain side and turn it into an outcome. So on the front end, you can use language like we lack this, or this is missing, or this is broken. Like you want to use language like it's not working. And on the back end, you want to use an outcome language. So not create an ICP, that's an action. We have clarity of our ideal customer is the outcome. We have a clear ideal customer as the outcome, not create an ICP. Create an ICP is an action. And I should say that you don't need to do this for every problem in your life. If this is if it's a simple problem, like, hey, we're not all using the same email signature. It's like, we probably don't need to do a full diagnostic of what's going on. We can just say, hey, can you send out an email to remind people to do that? Yes. Right. Like, we're not talking about simple problems. We're talking about things that have complexity, multiple parts, that have more of a system component to it. You don't need to do this process over really simple kind of cause and effect relationships, right? But if it's something that's complicated, that has multiple moving parts, involves multiple people, or has a lot of ambiguity around it, that's a good indicator of, okay, I should just take a few minutes and do this process, either for myself or for my team. And the more you do it, the faster it goes and the better you get. All right. So the last piece then is you take, okay, if this is where we are, so we don't have a clear target market, we're not getting the leads, and what we want at the end is a very clear target audience. Now you start to say, okay, well, what are the actions? What's the path? Right. So so the big action would be we need to identify, like, we need to create an ICP. So now I want to take that and I want to say, okay, so what are the first, like, what are the milestones? What are the big pieces that we need to do? So you might say, I'm gonna reach out, or I'm gonna do an exercise called red, yellow, green. I'm gonna look at who are my green clients, which are the clients I currently really like. What do I like about them? How do they think? Why do I like them? What do they pay? And who are my red clients? Who are the clients I don't like working with? So I'm going to distinguish between those two. So I'm going to capture, what does the green client, like, what's my ideal customer look like? I'm going to do that through examining my current customers. Milestone number 2 is I'm going to take that and I'm going to share that with my current client base, or I'm going to share that with certain people in my network to say, hey, does this resonate with you? I'm going to get to see if the story resonates. The third milestone might be to identify or create content that speaks directly to that ICP. Okay, great. Now I've created a step-by-step action item for me to then actually start to speak to my ICP. So then what are the tasks? Well, the task might be I'm going to set up a 15-minute, window of time for me to examine the red, yellow, green. I'm going to do X, Y, like, underneath each one of those, then you just identify, well, what are the tasks? And then you figure out, okay, who's doing what by when? Who owns it? That's where, like, a good role chart comes into play of, like, well, who's really responsible for this element on our team? Now you go to roles and who's responsible. That should tie into, scope scale of what your employees are charged to do. Right now, we're not arguing about who should be doing what, because it's pretty obvious if we know what the outcome is. Now it's whose role works towards achieving this outcome, as opposed to, I like your solution, I don't like yours, because we have a different end in mind, because we're looking at it from a different scope or scale. Like, if I'm looking at it as a leader versus I'm looking at it as a lower level employee, we're thinking about a different end. We have different intentions. But if we get clear about what that outcome is, the actions become a lot more clear. And so then this essentially is, okay, let's project manage this. Who's doing what by when? And now everybody is aligned around crushing that issue. We are not emptying buckets. We are actually fixing the leak. And everybody's moving in the same direction to solve that problem. And everybody's got deadlines, and we have accountability because we agreed on, here's the problem, here's where we're going, and here's what we're going to do about it. As opposed to, we talked about this issue and we talked about this issue and we talked about this issue, but it never seems like it goes away. The last piece in this, and part of why story is such a powerful framework for solving problems, is, again, it's how human beings are hardwired to think. It is the psychology of how we process information, and it's also the process and the psychology of how we communicate. So the double win here is we can get really clear on what the problem is, and we have a really clear story to tell the people that weren't in the room with us. So if we need to share, hey, what are we doing around this particular issue, with anybody who wasn't present for that meeting, or any team member who wasn't, or any potential customer, or whatever it might be, we can say, hey, here's the obstacles, here's the things that we uncovered as a problem, here's where we're going, here's what the happy ending looks like, and here's how we're trying to get there. And now, again, whoever we're communicating to, we're actually solving all the loops in their brain before they get to that place, right? Before they even get to the question, we've answered it by saying, here's the pain, here's what we want, here's what we're going to do about it, here's who's doing what by when. So the last piece is just to put the story together, right? Here's where we are, here's where we're going, here's what we're doing. I'm going to wrap it up here and just say, talked about in this brief workshop, in this brief training. There's so much more to dive into, but in this brief training, we've talked about, well, what's the psychology that gets in the way of solving the issues? What are the obstacles that we deal with? We've shared the story solving process with you to identify and crush those issues, gave you some time to think about the issue or something that you're thinking about to process through. And this is something that is knowable and repeatable, right? This isn't rocket science. This isn't something you need a degree to understand. It is a practiced and developed skill to teach our brains how to think like this. So we found it to be a really profound piece. We hope that you are as well. What questions do you have? And know that also, download your free piece. It's in your email. Also, if you want to, as part of joining this workshop, if you want to set up a call, do a 30-minute touch point with me, and you want to process through anything, please do that. That's just, join the workshop. jump on in. I'm happy to solve, or I'm happy to work through something with you as we go. So know that that's an